I didn't marry for love. I married out of pure, unadulterated spite. When my mother tried to auction me off to a corrupt senator to secure her social standing, I found the filthiest, most heavily scarred alpha living in a gutter behind the stock exchange. I slapped a cheap ring on his unwashed finger just to watch her plans burn. I thought I was ruining her life. I had no idea I was walking into a trap set by the man who owned the entire city. The silk tie felt like a noose. Beatrice, the woman who had birthed me purely for the biological collateral my secondary gender afforded her, adjusted the Windsor knot with sharp manicured nails. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes remained fixed on the mirror behind me, evaluating the drape of my tailored suit, the artificial flush on my cheeks, the carefully concealed edges of the suppressant patch at the base of my neck. "Stand up straight, Oliver," she murmured. Her voice was perfectly modulated, a cool glass of water laced with cyanide. "You're slouching. It makes your shoulders look broad. Alphas like Richard prefer their omegas delicate." I didn't adjust my posture. I just stared at her reflection. "Richard is 62 years old, Mother. He smells like stale cigars and liver medication. He's been investigated by the ethics committee 3 times. And he survived all 3 investigations." She countered smoothly, finally meeting my gaze in the glass. "Which speaks to his immense power. A power that will secure the Hayes family's position on the board of directors. You will smile tonight. You will laugh at his anecdotes. And when he offers you his hand to formalize the courting contract, you will take it." She patted my cheek 2 firm taps like a trainer praising a show dog, and swept out of the dressing room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, sealing me inside. I pressed my palms against the cool marble of the vanity. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with the scent of lilies and the sharp chemical tang of my own anxiety. In this city, an omega wasn't a person. We were walking mergers. We were acquisitions. Our heats were managed by pharmaceutical conglomerates, and our futures were charted in boardrooms. I'd spent 23 years playing the dutiful son, swallowing the bitter pills that kept my biology in check, attending the galas, nodding at the dull, arrogant alphas who looked at me like a prime cut of meat. But Richard was the breaking point. I had seen the way he looked at his previous omegas. Hollow-eyed, heavily medicated things trailing behind him at society functions. He broke them. Beatrice knew this. She just didn't care. The Hayes estate was hemorrhaging money, and I was the final asset left to liquidate. I pulled the tie from my neck, letting the expensive silk pool on the floor. I undid the top 3 buttons of my shirt. The air conditioning hit my skin, but I still felt feverish. I looked at the window. The rain was lashing against the glass, blurring the neon skyline of the financial district. A thought cold and sharp as a diamond crystallized in my mind. The courting contract Beatrice and Richard had drafted was airtight. Once signed, my biological autonomy belonged to him. The only clause that could void a binding courting arrangement was a pre-existing legal marriage. Beatrice assumed I was too complacent, too terrified of poverty to ever defy her by finding a mate of my own. She had kept me isolated, surrounded only by her approved list of suitors. But a marriage license didn't require a background check. It didn't require a pedigree. It only required 2 signatures, a notary, and $50 at the 24-hour civic registry downtown. I didn't stop to think. If I thought about it, the terror would paralyze me. I grabbed my coat, slipped my wallet into the inner pocket, and bypassed the main staircase. I took the servants' elevator down to the garage, slipping past the security detail, smoking by the loading dock. The street hit me like a physical blow. The rain was freezing, smelling of exhaust fumes and wet concrete. I didn't hail a cab. I just walked, putting as much distance between myself and the Hayes estate as my legs could manage. The towering glass facades of the corporate sector slowly gave way to the crumbling brick and flickering streetlights of the lower district. I needed an alpha, not just any alpha. I needed someone so thoroughly undesirable, so deeply repulsive to high society that the mere sight of him would shatter Beatrice's carefully constructed world. I needed a weapon disguised as a husband. The alleyways behind the old transit hub were notorious. A haven for the disenfranchised, the broken, the alphas, whose pheromone glands had been damaged by cheap industrial labor, the ones society threw away. I turned down a narrow, trash-strewn street. The smell was horrendous rotting garbage, stale urine, and the sour, desperate scent of distressed biology. I walked until the heels of my polished leather shoes were coated in grime. My expensive coat clung to my shivering frame. I scanned the shadows, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Then I saw him. He was sitting on a sodden piece of cardboard beneath the rusted overhang of a closed deli. He didn't look like a person. He looked like a pile of discarded rags that happened to be breathing. I approached slowly. As I got closer, the details emerged from the gloom. He was massive, his frame hunched and folded in on itself. A thick matted beard obscured most of his face, and a jagged, angry scar slashed down from his temple, disappearing into the collar of a frayed, oil-stained military jacket. One of his eyes was a milky, clouded white. The other was dark, flat, and completely devoid of light. He didn't emit the typical aggressive musk of a destitute alpha. He just smelled like damp, earth-wet dog and the faint metallic tang of copper. He didn't ask for change. He just stared at my expensive shoes as I stopped in front of him. "You're an alpha," I said. My voice trembled. I hated that it trembled. He didn't move. A slow, raspy breath rattled in his chest. "You're lost, little Omega." He grunted. His voice sounded like gravel being crushed under a heavy tire. "Uptown is that way. Walk fast before someone decides your coat is worth bleeding for." "I'm exactly where I want to be." I lied, forcing my chin up. I reached into my coat and pulled out a crisp, damp $100 bill. I dropped it on the cardboard. His good eye tracked the money, but his hands, large scarred, coated in a layer of permanent dirt, didn't move to take it. "What's the catch?" "I need a favor," I said, my voice hardening. "I need a husband." The alpha blinked. A slow, ugly laugh scraped out of his throat, turning into a wet cough. He leaned back against the brick wall, pulling the collar of his jacket tighter. "Look at me, kid. I'm a cripple. I sleep next to a dumpster. I eat whatever the rats don't finish. You're wearing a watch that costs more than I've made in 2 lifetimes. Go find a frat boy with daddy issues." "I don't want a frat boy. I want you." I knelt down, ignoring the cold, filthy water soaking into my tailored trousers. I forced myself to look directly into his ruined face. Up close, the scars were even worse, raised and purple in the dim light. "I have $50 for the license. I will pay for a hotel room for a week. You get a hot shower, 3 square meals a day, and a dry bed. In exchange, you sign a piece of paper saying we are legally bound. No touching. No mating bites. Strictly paper." He went still. The flat, dead look in his eye shifted just for a fraction of a second, revealing something sharp and terrifyingly alert beneath the surface. But then it was gone, replaced by the dull apathy of a street vagrant. "Why me?" he rasped. "Because you are exactly what my mother hates." I said, the venom in my voice surprising even me. "Because if I walk into her house with you on my arm, she will lose her mind." He studied me. The silence stretched heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of the rain hitting the metal overhang. I held my breath, the adrenaline beginning to crash, leaving me cold and terrified. What was I doing? I was bargaining my life away to a stranger in an alley. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He leaned heavily on his left leg, grimacing. He towered over me, a hulking mass of shadow and grim survival. "Name's Arthur," he muttered, holding out a hand caked in dirt and engine grease. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and shockingly warm. "Oliver." The walk to the civic registry was a blur. We moved in silence. Arthur limped heavily beside me, dragging his left leg, his ragged breathing filling the quiet streets. People crossed the street to avoid us. A polished, wealthy Omega and a terrifying, scarred vagrant. We looked like a kidnapping in progress. The registry office was brightly lit, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. The clerk behind the plexiglass window looked up from his magazine, his eyes widening in disgust as Arthur approached the counter, dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor. "Forms!" Arthur demanded, his voice dropping an octave, rattling the glass. The clerk swallowed hard, fumbling with a stack of papers. He shoved them through the slot. $50, both signatures, thumbprints required. I paid the fee. I took the pen. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely form the letters of my own name. Oliver Hayes. I slid the paper over to Arthur. He didn't read the contract. He just gripped the pen in his massive fist and scrawled a messy, illegible signature at the bottom. Arthur Galloway. He pressed his ink-stained thumb onto the paper. I did the same. The clerk stamped it. Whack. It was done. I was married. I looked at the piece of paper, then up at the filthy, hulking man standing beside me. There was no bond, no sudden rush of pheromones, just a cold, sinking realization that I'd crossed a line from which I could never return. I was legally tethered to a beggar. "Well, husband," Arthur grunted, wiping a streak of dirty rainwater from his scarred jaw. "Where's this warm bed you promised?" "First," I said, my voice tight, "we have a dinner party to crash." The Hayes estate was glowing with warm, amber light when the taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates. I paid the driver, who looked terrified to even have Arthur in his back seat. The security guard at the gatehouse stepped out his hand, instinctively dropping to his baton when he saw the hulking silhouette behind me. "Mr. Hayes," the guard stammered. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing off the wet pavement. I grabbed Arthur's sleeve. The fabric was damp and smelled atrocious. "Open the gate." Marcus hesitated, but he hit the button. The heavy iron swung open. We walked up the sweeping driveway. I could see the silhouettes of the guests through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the dining room. Beatrice's elite circle, senators, CEOs, pharmaceutical tycoons, and Richard. My heart hammered a frantic beat against my ribs. I felt a wave of nausea. I almost turned back. I almost told Arthur to leave, that I would send him the money for a hotel. But then I saw Richard's silver Bentley parked in the prime spot near the fountain. I set my jaw. I pushed open the massive front doors. The foyer was quiet, but the dining room to the left was buzzing with the low murmur of wealthy, self-important conversation. I didn't take off my wet coat. I didn't offer to take Arthur's. I just walked straight into the dining room, pulling my new husband by the arm. The conversation died instantly. It was like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. 15 heads turned toward the doorway. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The string quartet in the corner faltered, ending on a screeching, discordant note. The silence was absolute. Beatrice sat at the head of the long mahogany table, perfectly poised, a glass of red wine in her hand. Beside her sat Richard, his thinning hair plastered to his scalp, his expensive cologne failing to mask the sour, rotting scent of aging, aggressive alpha. Beatrice's eyes dropped from my wet, disheveled hair down to the soaked hem of my trousers, and finally landed on Arthur. Arthur stood there dripping dirty alley water onto the $1 million Persian rug. He leaned heavily on his bad leg, his milky eyes staring blankly at the crystal chandelier. He breathed loudly through his mouth, a wet rattling sound. The smell of him, wet dog, stale sweat, and damp earth began to quickly overpower the expensive perfumes and rich food in the room. "Oliver," Beatrice said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "What is the meaning of this? Who is this creature?" I let go of Arthur's sleeve and stepped forward. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the freshly stamped damp marriage certificate, and dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of Richard. "I apologize for my tardiness," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I was busy at the courthouse. Mother Richard, everyone, I'd like to introduce you to my legal husband, Arthur." A collective gasp rippled through the room. A wealthy Omega dropping her fork sent a sharp clink echoing into the silence. Richard looked at the paper. His face turned a mottled, furious purple. He slammed his fist onto the table, making the crystal wine glasses jump. Beatrice! What kind of sick joke is this? Beatrice didn't look at him. She stared at the paper. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking old and hollowed out. She slowly stood up. She walked around the table, her heels clicking ominously on the hardwood floor, until she stood directly in front of me. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She raised her hand and struck me across the face with the back of her hand. The crack of her rings against my cheekbone was loud. My head snapped to the side. I tasted copper. "You stupid, stupid boy!" She hissed, her pristine mask finally cracking, revealing the pure, venomous rage beneath. "You think you've won. You think throwing your life away in the gutter hurts me. You have ruined your own life." She turned to the private security detail standing by the walls. "Throw them out. Throw his belongings out. If he steps foot on this property again, break his legs." "Beatrice, you can't." I started the reality of what I had done suddenly crashing down on me. "I have no son." She interrupted, her voice vibrating with fury. She turned her back to me. "Get this filth out of my dining room." Two burly alpha guards approached. I braced myself to fight, but a heavy dirt-caked hand clamped down on my shoulder. "We're leaving," Arthur rasped. He didn't wait for the guards. He turned and limped out the door, pulling me with him. We were shoved out the front doors, stumbling onto the wet driveway. A few minutes later, 2 designer suitcases, hastily packed by a terrified maid, were thrown out onto the gravel beside us. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. The locks clicked. I stood in the freezing rain, my cheek burning, looking at my 2 suitcases. That was it. 23 years of life reduced to a pile of luggage in the rain. I was completely cut off. No money, no protection tethered to a vagrant. My legs gave out. I sank onto my suitcase, burying my face in my hands. A sob tore out of my throat, ugly and loud. What had I done? I had jumped from the frying pan directly into the fire. I felt a shadow loom over me. I looked up, expecting to see Arthur shivering, begging for that hotel room. Instead, I froze. Arthur was still standing in the rain, but something had changed. He wasn't slouching anymore. His shoulders, previously hunched in defeat, were rolled back, revealing a terrifyingly broad, imposing physique beneath the oversized military jacket. The exaggerated limp was gone. He stood perfectly balanced, perfectly still. And the smell. The sour, wet dog scent of the gutter was evaporating, washing away in the heavy downpour. In its place, something else was blooming. A scent so dense, so purely overwhelmingly alpha, that it made the air around him feel heavy. It smelled like crushed pine needles, ozone, and dark, expensive leather. It was a scent that demanded submission. It was a scent that spoke of absolute, unquestionable power. He reached up, wiped the wet, matted hair from his good eye, and looked down at me. The flat, dead stare was gone. His dark eye was sharp, calculating, and gleaming with a cold, predatory amusement. "Well, Oliver," he said. His voice was no longer a gravelly rasp. It was deep, smooth, and resonated with authority. "That was quite a show. Now shall we go to my house?" I stared at him. The rain beat down on the gravel driveway, flattening my hair against my skull and soaking my expensive trousers to the skin. My mind violently rejected what my eyes were seeing. The man standing in front of me was not a beggar. The physical dimensions were the same. He was still a hulking mass of muscle and bone, but the architecture of his posture had shifted entirely. The pathetic hunched vagrant from the alley was gone. In his place stood a man whose sheer physical presence displaced the air around him. The milky dead eye had been a trick of the light, or perhaps a contact lens. His gaze was now piercing dark and ruthlessly sharp. "Your house," I repeated. My voice cracked. The freezing rain suddenly felt completely irrelevant compared to the suffocating wave of pheromones rolling off him. Crushed pine, ozone, dark leather. It was a scent designed by biology to force an omega to their knees. My suppressants, usually a reliable wall of chemical apathy, shrieked in protest. Before he could answer, twin beams of blinding white light cut through the deluge. A matte black Maybach glided silently up the driveway, stopping mere inches from our discarded luggage. It wasn't an Uber. It wasn't a taxi. It was a rolling fortress of armored glass and reinforced steel. Behind it, a sleek black SUV idled its engine a low, menacing purr. The driver's side door of the Maybach opened. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out into the downpour. He didn't flinch at the rain. He opened a massive black umbrella, walked around the hood, and opened the rear passenger door for Arthur. "Evening, Mr. Galloway," the driver said. His voice was clipped professional, completely unfazed by the fact that he was addressing a man covered in alley grime. "The estate has been secured." Arthur didn't reply. He looked at me. "Get in the car, Oliver." I took a step back, my wet shoes crunching loudly on the gravel. No, absolutely not. Who are you?" "I am the man you legally bound yourself to 45 minutes ago," Arthur stated. His tone was perfectly level. There was no anger, no impatience, just the terrifying calm of a man who owned the ground he stood on. "You have 2 suitcases, $0, and a mother who just ordered her security to break your legs if you return. Get in the car." My brain frantically processed the variables. Option A: run into the stormy streets of a city where my mother held immense political influence with no money, no phone, and nowhere to sleep. Option B: get into an armored car with a stranger who possessed the scent profile of an apex predator. Survival instinct is a cruel, pragmatic thing. I grabbed the handles of my suitcases. The driver stepped forward effortlessly, taking the heavy bags from my trembling hands and stowing them in the trunk. I slid into the back seat. The interior smelled of expensive leather detailing and the faint, sterile scent of air conditioning. Arthur climbed in beside me. The door closed with a heavy vault-like thud, instantly cutting off the sound of the storm. As the car accelerated smoothly away from the Hayes estate, Arthur reached into a hidden compartment between the seats. He pulled out a sterile, prepackaged medical wipe. With methodical precision, he began to scrub his face. I watched in morbid fascination. The thick layer of soot dirt and engine grease dissolved. The matted, filthy beard was real, but beneath the grime, his skin was tanned and rugged. He reached up, pinched the surface of his cloudy left eye, and pulled out a thick, milky contact lens. He tossed it into a small disposal bin. Both of his eyes were now a striking, predatory amber. The jagged scar running down his temple was real. It looked like a blade had narrowly missed taking his eye, leaving a permanent pale ridge of tissue. It didn't make him ugly. It made him look violently untouchable. He unbuttoned the foul-smelling military jacket, shrugging it off his broad shoulders and tossing it onto the floorboard. Beneath it, he wore a simple dark t-shirt that stretched tight across his chest. "Arthur Galloway," I whispered. The name had been echoing in my head since he signed the registry, but panic had suppressed the connection. Now, in the quiet luxury of the Maybach, the pieces snapped into place. Galloway Industries, the conglomerate that owned the shipping ports, the pharmaceuticals, the real estate. They were the invisible monopoly that held the city by the throat. Nobody knew what the CEO looked like. He was a phantom, a ghost who communicated through a terrifyingly efficient board of directors. "You're dead," I said bluntly. "The papers said you died in a helicopter crash in the Alps 3 years ago. The papers print what my media division tells them to print," Arthur replied, leaning back against the leather headrest. He finally looked at me. His amber eyes swept over my shivering, soaked frame. "A convenient death is the easiest way to weed out the traitors in your own company. It's amazing what rats will do when they think the cat is dead. So you just sat in an alley for 3 weeks, he corrected. "The man who organized the sabotage of my helicopter runs a trafficking ring out of the lower transit hub. He's careful. He doesn't deal with suits. He deals with the desperate. So I became desperate." I stared at him. "You were running an undercover sting operation from a cardboard box. I was acquiring intelligence," he said smoothly. And then a very angry, very expensive Omega walked up to my box, handed me a $100 bill, and asked me to ruin his mother's life. I found the proposition mathematically intriguing. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. I rubbed my hands over my face. The sheer absurdity of it all was crushing. I hadn't married a beggar to spite my mother. I had accidentally tethered myself to the apex predator she spent her entire life trying to emulate. "You tricked me," I muttered. "You approached me," Arthur countered. "You demanded a legal binding. I merely complied with your terms. But the circumstances have changed. We are going to have to renegotiate." The Maybach bypassed the wealthy residential districts, entirely descending into the private subterranean parking structure of the Galloway Spire, a 100-story monolith of black glass in the center of the financial district. We took a private elevator that moved so fast my ears popped. When the doors slid open, I stepped out into a space that defied comprehension. It wasn't just a penthouse. It was an estate suspended in the clouds. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a 360-degree view of the city skyline, the neon lights glittering like shattered glass in the rain. The floors were dark polished stone. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and intimidating. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no art. It looked less like a home and more like a tactical command center. I stood frozen in the entryway, shivering violently. The adrenaline was leaving my system, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling cold. "David!" Arthur called out. A man in a sleek gray suit stepped out of the shadows of a hallway. He bowed his head slightly. "Sir, take his bags to the East Wing. Have the staff prepare a hot shower and dry clothes. Then call Dr. Aris. I want a full medical evaluation in the morning." "Wait!" I snapped, my defensive instincts flaring. I wrapped my wet arms around my chest. "I don't need a doctor, and I'm not staying in a wing. I'm leaving. Tomorrow morning we void the registry. I'll claim I was intoxicated. You can go back to pretending to be dead, and I'll figure something out." Arthur stopped halfway across the expansive living room. He turned slowly. The sheer mass of him was terrifying. He walked back toward me, his heavy footsteps silent on the stone floor. He stopped 2 feet away. The heat radiating off his body was palpable. The scent of ozone and pine intensified, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. I forced myself to hold his gaze. I refused to look down. I refused to bare my throat. "You will not void the registry," Arthur said. His voice was low, vibrating in my chest. "Let me explain the reality of your situation, Oliver." He held up a hand, ticking off points on his calloused fingers. "Your finances. Your mother froze your personal accounts the moment her front doors closed. I received the alert on the drive here. You have zero capital. Your biology. Your suppressant patch is fraying at the edges. Without your family's pharmaceutical connections, you will plunge into an unmedicated heat within 72 hours. On the streets, that is a death sentence. Your mother's wrath. Beatrice Hayes is vindictive. By tomorrow afternoon, she will have blacklisted you from every employer, landlord, and social circle in this state." Every word was a nail in my coffin. He was right. He was entirely devastatingly right. "So what do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why keep me? You don't need a husband." "No," Arthur agreed. "I don't need a husband, but I do need an Omega." He turned and walked toward a massive, sleek kitchen island, gesturing for me to follow. He tapped a hidden panel, and a holographic screen materialized from the surface of the counter. "I have spent 3 years dead," Arthur explained, pulling up heavily redacted financial charts. "In that time, the board of directors has grown bold. They are attempting to dilute my shares. To reclaim absolute control without triggering a massive stock panic, I cannot simply rise from the grave. I need to re-enter society as a stable, legally bound alpha. The public trusts a mated alpha. The board fears a mated alpha who suddenly appears out of thin air." He tapped the screen again. A digital document appeared. "I need a shield," Arthur said, looking at me. "And you need a sword. Your mother tried to sell you to Richard to cover her debts. If you work with me, I will ensure Beatrice Hayes never dictates another breath you take." He swiped his hand and the holographic document expanded into a 2-column contract. "These are my terms. Read them." I leaned over the counter, water dripping from my hair onto the sleek surface, and read the illuminated text. Arthur's obligations. The Alpha. Oliver's obligations. The Omega guarantee. Absolute financial independence for Oliver, including a personal trust fund and unrestricted black card access. Act as the public face of the Galloway household at high-level social and corporate events. Provide premium, unmonitored suppressants to ensure Oliver retains full biological autonomy, no forced heats. Maintain the physical illusion of a bonded, devoted mate in the presence of the board of directors and the press. Systematically dismantle the Hayes family's corporate standing and neutralize Beatrice Hayes's political influence. Relocate permanently to the Galloway penthouse and sever all unauthorized contact with former Hayes associates. Strictly enforce a platonic physical boundary. No mating bites, no unconsented touch behind closed doors. Never disclose the true nature of Arthur Galloway's 3-year absence or his undercover operations. I stared at the glowing table. It was clinical. It was cold. It was the exact opposite of the degrading, biologically restrictive courting contract Beatrice had tried to force upon me. No mating bites, I repeated, my eyes lingering on the bolded text. You swear to that. I am a businessman, Oliver, not an animal, Arthur said. His amber eyes were unreadable. I do not take things that are not freely given. You will have your own wing. You will have your own life. When the cameras are on, you will smile and hold my hand. When the doors close, we are simply 2 people executing a hostile takeover of this city. I looked at him, really looked at him. He was a monster, yes, but he was an honest monster. He wasn't hiding behind polite smiles and fake civility like the men in my mother's dining room. He laid his cruelty on the table and let me measure it. Fine, I said, my voice finally steadying. I'll be your shield. Arthur nodded once. A decisive, sharp movement. Good. Now go shower. You smell like an alleyway. I blinked, thoroughly offended. I smell like an alleyway because you dragged me into an alleyway. A muscle in Arthur's jaw twitched. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw the ghost of a smile pull at the corner of his scarred mouth, but it was gone before I could be sure. David will show you to your quarters, Arthur said, turning back to his holographic screens. The dismissal was absolute. I followed the man named David down a long, dimly lit corridor. My heart was still hammering, but the blind panic had subsided. I had jumped into the abyss, and somehow I had landed on solid gold. I woke up the next morning feeling like I had been hit by a freight train. The stress of the previous night had settled deep into my joints. I opened my eyes to a ceiling of flawless white. I was lying in a bed roughly the size of a small island wrapped in sheets that felt like liquid silk. Memory rushed back sharp and unforgiving. The auction block, the rain, the beggar, the Maybach, the contract. I sat up abruptly. The room was massive, decorated in muted grays and deep blues. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a stunning, sun-drenched view of the city. I wasn't just above the financial district. I was looking down on it. I threw off the covers and walked into the adjoining bathroom. It was a masterpiece of black marble and brushed steel. The shower had 6 different jet settings. I stripped off the ridiculously soft pajamas the staff had left for me and stood under the scalding water until the lingering chill of yesterday's rain finally melted from my bones. When I emerged, I found fresh clothes laid out on the bed. They weren't my old clothes. They were brand new, perfectly tailored, and devoid of the stiff, restrictive cuts my mother always forced me to wear. A pair of soft, dark slacks and a charcoal cashmere sweater. There was also a small velvet box sitting on the nightstand. I opened it. Inside rested a single transdermal suppressant patch. It wasn't the cheap generic brand Beatrice bought to cut costs. It was military grade, the kind of synthetic hormone blocker that could hide an Omega's scent entirely making them practically invisible to passing alphas. Arthur had kept his first promise. I applied the patch to the base of my neck. Almost instantly, the low-level hum of biological anxiety that always sat in the back of my mind quieted down. I took a deep breath, feeling clear-headed for the first time in weeks. I left the bedroom and navigated the silent, echoing halls of the penthouse. I found Arthur in what appeared to be a home office, though it looked more like a trading floor. 4 massive monitors dominated the back wall, displaying rapidly scrolling data streams and news feeds. Arthur was sitting behind a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark wood. He was wearing a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up over his thick forearms, revealing a network of faded white scars that mapped across his skin. His hair was damp, pushed back from his rugged face. In the daylight, he looked even more intimidating. There was a raw, kinetic energy vibrating off him, barely contained by the expensive clothing. He didn't look up from his tablet as I walked in. "Coffee is in the carafe. Black. If you want milk, use the intercom." "Black is fine," I said, my voice sounding incredibly small in the massive room. I poured a cup from the silver carafe on a side table and took a sip. It was dark, bitter, and perfect. I walked over and stood in front of his desk. "So, we're married. What's step 1 of the master plan?" Arthur finally looked up. His amber eyes locked onto mine. "Step 1 is already complete. Look at screen 3. I turned my attention to the monitor on the far right. It was a live feed of the global financial news network. The ticker tape at the bottom of the screen was flashing a bright, urgent red. Breaking Haze Pharmaceuticals. Stocks. Plummet 14% at opening bell. I stared at the screen, my breath hitching. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Arthur said, leaning back in his chair and resting his hands on his stomach. "Richard did." "Richard?" "Richard is a coward who values his public image above all else." Arthur explained, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "When your mother failed to deliver you to him last night and you publicly embarrassed him by dropping a marriage certificate on his plate, he felt insulted. Alphas like Richard do not handle humiliation well. At 4 a.m., he officially pulled his investment from the Hayes estate. He called in his loans. My stomach dropped. Beatrice leveraged the entire company on those loans. If Richard pulls out, the company defaults," Arthur finished. "Which is exactly what happened at 8 a.m. when the markets opened. Panic ensued. The stock is in free fall. I gripped the warm coffee cup, my knuckles turning white. Beatrice's empire was crumbling. The foundation she had built on the backs of omegas like me was shattering in real time. A part of me, a dark, bruised part of my soul, wanted to cheer, but the pragmatic side of me knew how dangerous my mother was when backed into a corner. "She won't just roll over," I said, looking back at Arthur. "She'll find another buyer. She'll liquidate assets. She'll survive." Arthur smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It didn't reach his eyes. It was simply a baring of teeth. "No, she won't," Arthur said softly, "because at 8:05 a.m. a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands began aggressively buying up every single dumped share of Hayes Pharmaceuticals." I stared at him, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "You, me," Arthur confirmed. He tapped his tablet. "By noon, Galloway Industries will be the majority shareholder of your mother's company. I will own her board. I will own her patents. I will own the very walls of her estate." I felt dizzy. The sheer scale of his wealth, the predatory speed of his retaliation, it was incomprehensible. I had asked a beggar for a favor. I had married a god of commerce. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Why move so fast? You could have waited." Arthur stood up. He moved with a heavy, fluid grace that belied his massive size. He walked around the desk until he was standing right in front of me. I had to tilt my head back to look him in the eye. The scent of crushed pine and ozone flared not aggressively, but as a heavy protective blanket. "Because," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low rumble, "nobody throws what belongs to me out into the rain. Not anymore. He reached out. I flinched, my instinct to brace for an impact hardwired into my brain by years of Beatrice's discipline. But Arthur didn't strike me. He gently brushed a stray damp curl away from my forehead. His touch was shockingly warm, his rough, calloused fingers contrasting wildly with the gentleness of the motion. "Go get dressed properly, Oliver." He murmured, his thumb briefly grazing my cheekbone right over the faint bruise where my mother's ring had struck me the night before. "We have a press conference at 2 o'clock. It's time for the dead to rise." The press room on the 90th floor of the Galloway Spire was a cavern of acoustic paneling and cold, brilliant lighting. I stood in the wings, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain, watching the room fill. It was a feeding frenzy. Every major financial network, every society blog, every corporate watchdog had scrambled to team the moment Galloway Industries issued the vague, urgent media alert. They sat in rows of folding chairs, buzzing with nervous energy. The prevailing rumor was a hostile takeover by a rival conglomerate or a massive federal indictment. Nobody suspected a ghost story. "Breathe," Arthur murmured. He was standing right behind me. He wasn't wearing the three-piece suit of a standard CEO. He wore a bespoke charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, the dark fabric throwing his scarred face and amber eyes into sharp relief. He looked like a man who had climbed out of a grave and decided he liked the view. "I am breathing," I said, my voice tight. "I'm just calculating the statistical probability of me vomiting on live television. 0. Arthur replied, his tone flat and utterly certain. "Your heart rate is elevated, but your cortisol levels are stable. The military-grade patch is holding. You smell like nothing but the soap you used this morning." I looked over my shoulder. "You can smell my cortisol levels. I can smell a shift in the barometric pressure from 3 miles away," he said, stepping closer. The heavy grounding scent of crushed pine washed over me, a deliberate calibrated dose designed to steady my nerves. "You are my legal mate. Biologically, my primary directive right now is to ensure you do not feel threatened. The press is a threat. Consequently, I'm going to neutralize them. All you have to do is stand there and look exactly as expensive and untouchable as you are." He held out his hand. His knuckles were thick, dusted with faint white scars. I looked at his hand, then up at his face. He wasn't asking for my submission. He was asking for his shield. I placed my hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and entirely steady. "Showtime," David the assistant murmured into a headset, nodding to Arthur. The heavy curtains parted. We walked out onto the brightly lit stage. The reaction was instantaneous. The low murmur of the room didn't just stop, it flatlined. 100 reporters stared at the podium. Then the recognition hit. A reporter in the front row, a veteran financial anchor, dropped his digital recorder. The clatter echoed loudly in the dead silence. Arthur didn't smile. He didn't wave. He walked to the center of the podium, pulling me to stand slightly ahead of him, entirely visible, entirely claimed. He leaned down to the microphone. "Good afternoon." Arthur's voice boomed through the speakers, a deep resonant bass that vibrated in the floorboards. "I apologize for the short notice. I understand my presence here is something of an anomaly given the obituary you all printed 3 years ago." Pandemonium erupted. Flashbulbs exploded in a blinding wave of white light. 100 voices screamed questions simultaneously. The noise was a physical wall, deafening and chaotic. I flinched, my grip tightening on Arthur's hand. He stepped slightly forward, his broad shoulder acting as a physical barrier between me and the flashing lights. He raised his free hand. One single sharp motion. The room quieted. It took 10 seconds, but the sheer overwhelming authority radiating from him forced the journalists back into their seats. 3 years ago, the helicopter transporting me to a summit in Geneva suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Arthur stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "It was not an accident. It was an act of corporate sabotage orchestrated from within my own board of directors. I survived the crash." He tapped the pale scar near his eye. "Barely. but I realized that returning immediately would only force the rats back into the walls. So I let them think they had won. He scanned the room. His amber eyes were predatory, locking onto the lenses of the broadcasting cameras. For 3 years, I have operated in the shadows. I have audited every subsidiary, every offshore account, every shadow proxy tied to Galloway Industries. I know exactly who sold me out. The indictments were filed with the federal prosecutor an hour ago. A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. He was casually dismantling the financial hierarchy of the city on live television. But I did not operate alone. Arthur continued his thumb gently stroking the back of my knuckles. It was a calculated gesture designed for the cameras, but the warmth of it sent a strange grounding jolt up my arm. During my recovery, I found the one thing I required to step back into the light, a reason to return. He turned to me. The cameras pivoted instantly, their lenses zooming in. Allow me to introduce my legal bonded husband, Oliver Galloway. The flashbulbs flared again. I kept my chin high, my face a carefully constructed mask of aristocratic boredom. I let the cameras capture the tailored cut of my clothes, the subtle glimmer of the simple platinum band Arthur had procured that morning, and the undeniable reality of my position. I was no longer Oliver Hayes, the liquidated asset. I was Oliver Galloway, untouchable. Mr. Galloway. A reporter shouted from the third row, shoving his way past a cameraman. Oliver Hayes is the son of Beatrice Hayes. Hayes Pharmaceuticals stock plummeted this morning after Richard Vance pulled his backing. Are you stepping in to save your mother-in-law's company? Arthur leaned into the microphone. His smile was razor thin. Save it? Arthur asked smoothly. No, I bought it. As of noon today, Galloway Industries holds a 51% controlling stake in Hayes Pharmaceuticals. We are not saving Beatrice Hayes. We are restructuring her entirely. The press room descended into absolute chaos, but Arthur was finished. He stepped back from the podium, kept my hand securely in his, and turned toward the wings. We walked off the stage. The heavy curtains closed, muffling the roar of the journalists. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. My legs felt slightly weak. Arthur immediately released my hand, respecting the physical boundary the second we were out of the public eye. You did perfectly, Arthur said, turning to David. Have the car ready in the subterranean bay. We leave in 5 minutes. Where are we going? I asked, rubbing my wrist where the ghost of his grip still lingered. Arthur looked at me, his amber eyes catching the dim light of the backstage corridor. We're going to fire your mother. Hayes Pharmaceuticals was housed in a sterile glass and steel compound on the edge of the medical district. It was a monument to Beatrice's ambition, cold, pristine, and built entirely on ruthless margins. The rain had stopped leaving the city skies a bruised, heavy gray. The matte black Maybach pulled up to the front entrance, entirely ignoring the no parking zone. The driver didn't even blink as a security guard jogged over, waving his hands. Arthur stepped out of the car. The security guard stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at Arthur's sheer size, the terrifying scars, and the aura of absolute uncompromising dominance. The guard slowly lowered his hands and took 3 steps back. I slid out of the car after him. We walked through the sliding glass doors, bypassing the reception desk completely. Excuse me, sir, you need a badge? The receptionist called out, her voice trembling. Arthur didn't acknowledge her. He walked straight to the executive elevators and pressed the call button. The doors slid open. We stepped inside, and he hit the button for the top floor. The ride was silent. I stared at our reflections in the polished steel doors. I looked completely different from the shivering, broken Omega who had fled his mother's house 24 hours ago. My posture was straight. My clothes were armor. And the man standing next to me was a nuclear deterrent. She will try to manipulate you, Arthur said quietly, not looking away from the floor indicator. She will appeal to your guilt. She will remind you of your biological duty. Do not engage with her on her terms. I know how my mother works, I replied, my voice steady. I spent my whole life surviving her. You aren't surviving anymore, Oliver, Arthur said. The elevator chimed as we reached the top floor. He turned his head and looked at me. You're conquering. Remember the difference. The doors slid open. The executive floor was in a state of muted panic. Assistants were practically running down the carpeted hallways carrying stacks of files. Phones were ringing incessantly. At the far end of the corridor, the frosted glass doors of the main boardroom stood slightly ajar. We walked down the hall. Nobody stopped us. They were too busy watching their corporate ship sink. I pushed the heavy glass doors open. The boardroom was a war zone. Papers were scattered across the massive mahogany table. 7 board members sat in stunned silence. Beatrice stood at the head of the table, her usually immaculate hair slightly frayed, her face pale and drawn. She was gripping the edge of the table, yelling at her chief financial officer. I don't care about the Cayman proxy. Beatrice shrieked, her voice shrill and desperate. Find out who the buyer is. We need an injunction. We need to freeze the trade. You can't freeze the trade, Beatrice, I said loudly. My voice cut through the panic like a gunshot. The room went dead silent. Beatrice's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto me. For a second, pure, unadulterated fury flashed across her face. Then she noticed the man standing beside me. She looked at Arthur. She looked at the expensive suit. She looked at the scars. The connection didn't immediately happen. Her brain couldn't reconcile the filthy beggar in her dining room with the towering apex alpha standing in her boardroom. Oliver, Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with venom. How dare you show your face here? I told you you are disowned. Security works for me now, Arthur stated. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a lethal heavy weight. He walked slowly toward the table. The board members instinctively pushed their chairs back, desperate to put distance between themselves and the crushing wave of his pheromones. Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out a thick legal document, and tossed it onto the table. It slid perfectly across the polished wood, stopping directly in front of Beatrice. Arthur Galloway, Beatrice whispered. The color drained entirely from her face. She looked like she had just seen a ghost, which technically she had. You're dead. Reports of my death were highly exaggerated, Arthur said, stopping a few feet from her. The document in front of you is a formal declaration of majority ownership. Galloway Industries now owns 51% of Hayes Pharmaceuticals. And as my first act as majority shareholder, I am restructuring the executive board. Beatrice stared at the paper. Her hands began to shake. She looked up at Arthur, then her eyes darted to me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The beggar, the marriage certificate, the sudden catastrophic ruin of her company. You, she breathed, pointing a trembling manicured finger at me. You planned this, you treacherous, ungrateful little... She lunged forward. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. Before she could take 2 steps, Arthur stepped smoothly in front of me. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't take a defensive stance. He simply stood there, an immovable wall of muscle and bone. He let out a low, warning growl, a sound so primal and deeply territorial that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Beatrice froze. Her biological instincts overrode her rage. An Omega does not charge a claiming alpha. It was a hardwired law of nature. She stumbled back, hitting the edge of the conference table. Do not speak to my husband, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly register. Do not look at him. Do not even think about him. Your access to him is permanently revoked. He turned his attention back to the board members, who looked ready to faint. Beatrice Hayes is hereby terminated from her position as CEO effective immediately, Arthur announced. Security will escort her from the building if she attempts to take any proprietary data press charges. The rest of you have exactly 1 hour to submit your resignations, or I will initiate a full forensic audit of your personal finances. Have a productive afternoon. He turned away from the table. He didn't look at Beatrice again. He offered his arm to me. I looked at the woman who had made my life a living hell. She looked small. She looked broken. The empire she had built by selling me out had collapsed in less than a day. I expected to feel a rush of triumphant joy. I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. A hollow, heavy exhaustion. I didn't say a word to her. I didn't need to. I slipped my hand into the crook of Arthur's arm and let him lead me out of the glass boardroom. The doors closed behind us, sealing Beatrice Hayes in the tomb of her own ambition. The ride back to the penthouse was quiet. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the press conference and the corporate coup finally began to crash. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the Maybach window, watching the city lights blur together as evening set in. When we reached the penthouse, the silence of the massive space felt completely different than it had the night before. Yesterday it had felt like a prison. Tonight it felt like a fortress. Arthur took off his suit jacket, tossing it over the back of a minimalist leather armchair. He unbuttoned his collar, the rigid formality of the CEO melting away, leaving only the tired, heavily scarred man underneath. He walked toward the wet bar, his limp slightly more pronounced than it had been in public. The damp weather and the stress of the day were clearly taking a toll on his injuries. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't offer me one. He knew from my medical file that alcohol interfered with the synthetic suppressants. I stood in the center of the living room feeling entirely untethered. The battle was won. My mother was ruined. I was safe. So why did I feel like I was vibrating out of my skin? Go to your wing, Oliver, Arthur said. He was leaning against the counter, staring out at the city skyline. His voice was rough with fatigue. The staff brought up food, eat, sleep. Tomorrow my legal team will draft the trust fund documents. You are a very wealthy, very independent man. I looked at his broad back. I thought about the contract. Strictly enforce a platonic physical boundary. No unconsented touch behind closed doors. He was keeping his word. He was giving me my freedom. He was giving me exactly what I asked for. I took a slow breath. I didn't walk toward the east wing. I walked toward the kitchen. Arthur heard my footsteps. He turned his head, his amber eyes tracking my approach. He stiffened slightly, his posture defensive. He was an alpha who had spent 3 years expecting a knife in the dark. Trust did not come naturally to him. I stopped on the opposite side of the marble island. "Does it hurt?" I asked, looking down at his left leg. Arthur frowned. "It is functional. The pain is irrelevant." "That's not what I asked," I said softly. He stared at me for a long moment. The heavy silence stretched between us thick with unspoken questions. He took a slow sip of his drink. "Yes," he finally admitted, his voice a low rumble. "The titanium rod in my femur aches when the barometric pressure drops. The nerve damage in my shoulder throbs when I have to stand still for too long. I am a broken machine, Oliver, but I am still operational." "You don't have to be operational right now," I pointed out. "The cameras are gone. The board is terrified. My mother is out of the picture. You can sit down." Arthur's eyes narrowed. He was analyzing me, trying to find the angle, trying to calculate the strategic value of my words. He didn't understand compassion that wasn't transactional. "Why are you still standing here?" Arthur asked bluntly. "You have your money. You have your revenge. You have a massive bed and a locked door. Go use them." "Because I'm tired of being alone in large, empty rooms." I said the truth slipping out before my cynical filter could catch it. I walked around the island. Arthur tensed. His pheromones flared instinctively, a sharp, sudden spike of dark leather and ozone, warning me to keep my distance. I ignored it. I walked right up to him. I was inches away. The sheer heat radiating off his massive frame was intoxicating. I didn't touch him. I remembered the rules. But I stood close enough that our space was completely shared. "You gave me a sword and a shield," I murmured, looking up at his heavily scarred face. Up close, the damage was brutal, but it wasn't ugly. It was a map of survival. "But you didn't include a clause about what happens after the war is over." Arthur looked down at me. His amber eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark. He was fighting every biological instinct in his body to maintain the boundary he had promised. His breathing was shallow. He gripped the edge of the marble counter so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Oliver!" Arthur grunted, his voice incredibly strained. "Step back. I am heavily medicated for pain. My adrenaline is severely depleted, and you are entirely too close. Do not test my control." I'm not testing your control," I said quietly. I reached out. I didn't go for his throat or his chest or anywhere deeply vulnerable. I simply placed my hand flat against the heavy solid muscle of his forearm, right over the faded white scars. The moment my skin touched his, Arthur shuddered. A violently suppressed groan tore out of his throat. He dropped his head, leaning forward until his forehead rested against my shoulder. He didn't put his arms around me. He didn't trap me. He just leaned his massive, exhausted weight against me, trusting me to hold him up. The sharp defensive spike of ozone faded instantly. The scent that replaced it was deep, rich, and incredibly warm, like sun-baked earth and aged wood. It was the scent of an alpha who had finally stopped fighting. I stood there in the quiet penthouse, feeling the steady, heavy heartbeat of the monster who had saved my life. I slid my hand up his arm, my fingers lightly brushing the edge of his collar. "We need to amend the contract," I whispered into the quiet room. Arthur turned his head slightly, his cheek resting against the soft wool of my sweater. "Whatever you want," he rasped, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't entirely decipher. "The board is yours. The assets are yours. Ask for it, Oliver." I closed my eyes, leaning my head against his. "I don't want the assets, Arthur. I want the alpha, and that is how you execute a hostile takeover of your own life. I married for spite, but somewhere between the rain-soaked alleys and the quiet safety of the Galloway penthouse, the paper contract dissolved into something real. Arthur was the monster my mother feared, but he became my monster. We built our peace on the ashes of the empire that tried to sell me. If you loved this story of vengeance, power, and finding genuine loyalty in the darkest places, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more grounded ABO drama. Share this video with your friends, and tell me down in the comments, would you have risked it all for the beggar in the alley?